Welcome back to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman as we continue to examine the state of the burgeoning legal cannabis industry. In this segment, we examine the forces that could limit the potential growth within the industry and how the industry can help marginalized people and communities. As we continue our conversation with Morgan Fox of the National Cannabis Industry Association. One of the bigger surprises to me, Morgan, is that big companies from other fields have not entered the industry, at least not yet. I know some beer and tobacco companies have formed partnerships with Canadian cannabis companies. I'm wondering why they haven't entered the U.S. market, if you think they will, and would that be good or bad for the overall industry?
Well, I think you are seeing some big companies getting involved in cannabis, not necessarily from the beer and spirits and tobacco to a great extent. Although I think largely their lack of direct involvement is because they don't have the infrastructure for a product that is federally illegal and basically controlled by a patchwork of state regulations, but also because it's very difficult to become publicly traded in the United States if you're dealing with direct cannabis products. You are seeing a lot of involvement from other things like companies that grow or that have growing mediums or that produce things like topsoil or grow lights and all of these other things that help supply the cannabis industry that weren't necessarily directly involved in it before and are starting to realize that there's a lot of opportunity with this new market opening up where they can intersect with their existing businesses nicely.
On the sales side of the cannabis industry, we're hearing estimates that New York could do $4 billion in business in a year. We know Illinois just did $1 billion in 1 year. I'm curious about what I'll call the Atlantic City casino effect. Atlantic City had a monopoly on East Coast gaming, but the bottom fell out once casinos opened in nearby states and there was competition to that exclusivity. Here on the East Coast, we could see legal recreational cannabis from Maine to Virginia within a few years, which could lower both sales and revenue, at least as compared to those estimates. How big a concern should that be for people considering entering the market?
I really don't think that it should be that much of a concern at all. Outside of perhaps people that are operating retail establishments that are right along the border of states that either do not currently have legal markets or haven't set them up yet, or in the process of doing so, because those particular businesses stand to lose a little bit of their cross-border customer base. But overall, it's really not that big of an issue at the moment. Under federal law, it's basically impossible to do any interstate commerce with cannabis, and that creates sort of a silo effect within each state. Once cannabis is descheduled at the federal level and interstate commerce is allowed, that might mean that there's going to be more competition in nearby states, but it also means that you'll be able to do much more traditional agricultural commodity business, both within the country and internationally.
Morgan, the New York marijuana law contains a social equity component with half of all licenses designated for minority and women-owned businesses, for distressed farmers, disabled veterans, and also giving a boost to impacted neighborhoods and communities. Do you know if there are similar requirements in other states? And is there any way of knowing how that'll impact the overall industry? Might that restrict the ability of the market to sort of sort itself out?
Well, the biggest restrictor on the market is arbitrary license caps in every state. We're getting to a point now, and rightfully so, where you can't have a conversation about legalization without talking about the racially disproportionate harms that prohibition has caused and trying to find ways to help repair those harms through a variety of different methods, but most of them relating to community reinvestment as well as improving diversity within the cannabis industry and making sure that social equity applicants have the support in order to be able to succeed. That comes in a lot of different forms. New York's, on paper, is one of the better programs, both because of the large amount of the tax revenue that's being specifically diverted towards community reinvestment and restorative justice measures, but also the licensing carve-outs. But when you have a limited number of licenses to begin with, it really limits the effectiveness of those programs. There are several other states that are operating similar programs to varying degrees. And unfortunately, none of them have really been that successful. So there's definitely a learning curve there. And I think that state lawmakers and advocates are slowly starting to determine which programs work and which ones don't, and the ways in which to make sure that programs work in perpetuity.
Finally, Morgan, I wanted to ask you about the cannabis customer base. It seems safe to assume that people who use marijuana recreationally while it's still illegal will probably become customers once it's legal. And I'm sure there will be some who used to use it who begin using it again once legalization comes. But that strikes me as being a fairly limited set and a limited number of potential customers. I know that there are some restrictions on advertising. So how does the industry grow the customer base, or has that question not really been answered yet?
Well, the customer base is already there. The key is in making sure that legal regulated businesses are able to effectively compete with the unregulated market that those customers are used to patronizing. And a large amount of the inability for legal businesses to do that is because of things like not being able to access banking, incredibly high tax rates at both the state and federal level. Exorbitant regulatory costs associated with staying in compliance with all the various state regulations and rules. So we need to find a balance point where these programs are paying for themselves and their own administration, repairing the harms caused by the war on drugs, but are not taxed so heavily and hit with so many exorbitant fees that they're unable to survive while still being competitive at a price point against the unregulated market. And there's a relatively large subsection of the consumer base for whom price is the bottom line. So that is something that needs to be addressed. And I think that oftentimes there are roadblocks in the form of state lawmakers and regulators who really want to try to squeeze as much tax revenue as possible out of this industry without really realizing that by lowering the tax rates, they'll be able to generate much more tax revenue long term because more sales will take place in the regulated market.
Morgan Fox, Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association. Really appreciate it, Morgan. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Rich?
Thank you very much, Andrew. We'll be right back with more.